Good morning, Kate. How are you? I'm good. That's what I was worried about. It's like 1 in 5 times it comes through here. But now that it's pressed, it's good. It is exactly 10 o'clock. How are you doing?
I guess I'll go introduce him.
I wanted to make sure you switch that on so our conversation is going in.
So is this a rubber band? Or is this...
It's very similar to a rubber band. It's just so that it doesn't make noise if it rolls.
So did I do my intro or outro for yesterday? You didn't tell me the truth. What do you think?
Trying to think back to it. The first one was good. The second one you kind of stammered a little, but
On the intro or the outro?
the intro.
The intro, yeah.
Yeah, the outro was fine on both. But the second one you were kind of like you were searching for words. The silhouette, cast. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But other than that, it was great. The energy was good, and it looked confident. It was just until that moment I was like, oh come on, I hope she didn't forget.
Oh, yeah, and even the names. When I was trying to learn outro and the last show, I was like,
Yeah. That's tough for anyone, and I work with them every day.
All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, we have so many people upstairs. Hello, hello. Should we do the Mexican wave now? It still doesn't work. Hold on, one more time. Oh, yeah, that was good, that was great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to C Day 3. I hope you're going to have a fun day, relaxing day, and enjoy all the celebrity life activities here on board. We, of course, have none other than David Dillard, your Beyond the Podium speaker, as well as Michelle Monroe and Howard Lanning today. The two of them will be in the Celebrity Central, and you are here for David Dillard. So please, without further ado, let me introduce you our Beyond the Podium speaker, part of our enrichment program here on board. Thank you very much. This is Berlin, David Dillard.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for coming. We're having the captain's announcement, so that I hope doesn't interrupt my presentation here, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with my introduction, and then by the time I get into the meat of the program, I'm sure it will be over. But anyway, I'd like to welcome all of you, and today I'm going to just tell you quickly a little bit about myself. I am David Dillard, and as I explained in my previous lectures, I'm an architect. In the U.S., I practice architecture as a preservation architect. That means that I deal with historic buildings and structures. In England, for all of our British friends here, you call me a conservationist, which is the typical word used in Europe. Now, just part of my background, I was educated at Tulane University in historic preservation. I practiced architecture for about 35 years. And I have also consulted on archaeological works, and one of the things that I have in my repertoire, which is kind of interesting, is that I am a court-certified expert on something called lime plaster. And that may sound funny to you, but if you go to all of these buildings in Europe and the ones that you've seen, most of the interiors are made of lime plaster. So that's a specialty of mine, and I'm an expert in that. Now, today we're going to talk about Rostock and Berlin. I've had a number of people walk up to me and say, are you going to talk about Rostock? Yes, well, I'm going to tell you what I know about it. Rostock is a harbor. It's a place where you can get off to go into Berlin, just like Warnemünde, which is not too far away. But Berlin itself, I'll just say a few words about it. As far as all of the cities that we've visited, I would say that perhaps the most important one culturally, historically, and as far as societal evolution, is Berlin. And there are reasons for that that I'll give you in just a minute. One of the things that you need to know is that it's a big city. It's 3.7 million people within the metropolitan area of Berlin, and when you include the outlying subdivision or the suburbs of Berlin, we're talking about a population of approximately 6 million, which for Europe is very large. So it is one of the biggest capitals in Europe, but it is also, because of its history, probably, if not the, one of the most important, along with Paris, London, and perhaps some Rome. But anyway, moving along. Now, the original location of Berlin was at the intersection of the Spree and the Havel River. That's the river that you'll see when you go into the Museum Island, which I'll show you. But I want to just go back a little bit in time and see where we've been. Now, we came out of Southampton and went to Bruges first. Okay, our second stop was Copenhagen. Then we went to Stockholm, Tallinn, St. Petersburg, and now we are working our way back through the Baltic Sea. This is the Baltic. We're going back through this channel, through around Denmark, after we leave Berlin. But Rostock and Warnemünde, which are the two ports to get to Berlin, are located right about in this area. So I'm going to show you a little bit about where we sit as far as the overall picture of Northern Europe. You'll notice that we are about right on the same latitude as Warsaw. This is Poland here, right next to Germany. That's the German border. Warsaw and Berlin are on the same latitude. And this is what I call southern Northern Europe, because you have capitals like Oslo, which are very far north, and Copenhagen. Then you have Stockholm and Helsinki, and of course St. Petersburg way up here. And then these are the Baltic countries of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, over here on the southern part of the Baltic Sea. So after we leave Berlin, we'll be exiting the Baltic, and we will be going on to the North Sea again, back to Southampton. Now, the original name for the town of Rostock was Roztok. It's a Slavic word because it was settled by Slavic people rather than, say, for instance, Prussian or let's say the other surrounding countries. It was a Slavic settlement, and the thing that it's known for is that it has one of the oldest universities in the world. The University of Rostock is 1419, and the city became a member of the Hanseatic League, which I've spoken of before. Now, if you look at the port area, this is where you come in, and the first town there is Warnemünde, and many cruises go to Warnemünde for their docking. So you can be on a cruise and just as easily end up in Warnemünde as you can at Rostock. But anyway, it's there, and then Rostock is down here. So we will be traveling through this river, and you'll pass through this inlet getting into this body of water. And so that is how we get to Rostock. Now, what would I say there is to do there? Okay, one of the shore excursions, and I would advise you to look at your shore excursion list because there are several for Rostock as well as Warnemünde. Warnemünde is a recreation area. It has beaches and things like that. Rostock is going to be more of the museum type environment. There's some industrial things that they have museums for, and restaurants, that kind of thing. But there's some good walking, and on the tours you'll see some of the highlights of both of those places. And just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like, this is the city of Rostock from the water, and you can see it has some tour boats and a tall cathedral and some other buildings, but it's mainly known for it being a port city. So that's pretty much what you're going to get. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about traveling to Berlin because people have expressed to me, well, you know, Berlin's, they say, we have to go on a bus or a train. Look at your short excursion options, and I'll tell you what you're going to expect. Now, if you go by train, the Germans have what's called a U-Bahn and the S-Bahn. The S-Bahn is the above-ground train, and the U-Bahn is the, like U-boat, it's for the underground train. So when you get into Berlin, the U-Bahn would be your subway system. The S-Bahn is your overland train system. Now, if you were to go by train, you can take a 8:34 a.m. train. You would be in Berlin by 11:09 a.m. So roughly 8:30 to 11 is the time period for travel. That's about 2 hours and 40 minutes. If you go by bus, they've implemented a new bus that is a high-speed bus. Now, going into Berlin, and this is the bus route, you can see they have a straight line shot and it's non-stop. And this is specifically to get cruise ship people into Berlin. So the coaches that are listed on the short excursion will be traveling this route. Now, this is about 2 hours and 45 minutes to get there. On the way back, I'm not sure if the tours that are listed are using this service, but there's a high-speed bus that only takes 2 hours and 2 minutes to get from Berlin to Rostock. So check that out, because it's beautiful countryside. I did it, and I was very pleased. It was a view of the Germans as they really are in the countryside. Lots of farming and agricultural things going on. But it's just really, really a beautiful country, Germany. And everything is in perfect green right now with the summertime weather. And you'll see lots of people out, like farmers and livestock and that kind of thing. Now, when you get into Berlin, this is the Berlin Central train station, and the bus station is nearby. But it stops here, which is just north of what the main, I guess, as I showed in my first slide, the Brandenburg Gate, all right, built by Frederick for it's a peace symbol, which I'll talk about in a minute. But anyway, that was the gate to Brandenburg, okay, which was a neighboring city. So the Brandenburg Gate is here, and you can either walk or take the U-Bahn, and you'll be right in the middle of pretty much everything that I'm going to show, the highlights of Berlin, the places that you'll want to see. Now, let me just mention this before we go any further. Berlin is a large city, and it would be very easy to spend a week going to all of the different things if you wanted to go to, say, everything from Charlottenburg Palace to all of the Cold War exhibits, and then the art museums themselves. It would take a full week. So what I'm doing as your guest speaker, as your Beyond the Podium speaker, is I'm going to tell you the must-see things, the places where most tourists want to go first. And then if you have any questions about some detailed things, then I can show you or talk to you later. I'm always available. If you see me walking around the ship, I don't mind stopping and having coffee and talking. So please take advantage of asking me. I'm a friendly guy, so it won't bother me if you stop me. So let's go back in history just for a moment. I always like maps, as I've said. One of my passions is searching for old maps. And this is an old map of Berlin. And this map was drawn by Frederick Wilhelm in 1688. So we're talking about the 17th century depiction of Berlin. And you see the river, the Spree and the Havel rivers, and how this was just like, as we talked about in Bruges and Copenhagen, another fortified city. Now, why was it fortified? Well, one of the reasons, and this name keeps coming up, and I have been telling all of you how important the Hanseatic League was. The Hanseatic League was really sort of the Amazon of its time. And the cities like Berlin and like Rostock and like a lot of others, Tallinn, which was called Reval at the time, Bruges, those were all members of the Hanseatic League. So as a result of that, they had this tremendous economic advantage over cities that were not. And one of the things that you see in a Hanseatic League member is fortification, because they had a lot of valuable things there. They had a lot of goods, and they had a lot of ships coming and going, and there might be a reason for some pirates from somewhere to come and take it. But they were able to defend for that with the fortified city. So we have another fortified city here with Berlin. The first documented evidence of life in this area, as far as modern life, was about the 13th century. And so that would have been right after the Norseman age, going into the Hanseatic League age. So today, Berlin, of course, is much bigger. The area that is in the circle is the area that was depicted on the map that I just showed you, the older map, the 1688 map. And you can tell that Berlin has grown significantly around it. This is evidence of the economic prosperity, the scientific developments, the technology, and just the sheer fact that Germans are hardworking people, and they are magnificent in things like city planning and transportation routes. And over the period of time that Berlin has been in existence, even though it was completely bombarded during World War II, it still remains one of the most important hubs of science and technology in Europe, as well as it's a very important member of the European Union. And you've probably all seen Angela Merkel, who's always on TV, on the news, talking or meeting with somebody important about the European Union. She is a major leader in the European Union. So this is the overview. Now, what do they do in Berlin now? Well, it's high tech. There's pharmaceuticals, there's biomedical type facilities, we have engineering, there's universities. It's the home of Humboldt University, which was one of Europe's most important institutions for things like physics back during the day. And so today's Berlin, beyond the Cold War and the World War II history, has become one of the chief places where large corporations like Siemens and Mercedes-Benz, which is owned by the Daimler Corporation, have located. The IT, the technology is here, and that's what makes Berlin important today as well. So moving on, we're going to talk just for a moment. This I love because, like I said, I like maps. Well, I'm also sort of a spy novel guy. I like to read them. And this is a CIA map, okay? I came across this and I was fascinated, but I wanted to explain something. Now, I've been confused about this before. Okay, when you say the Cold War period and you had East Berlin and West Berlin, I thought that the country was somehow maybe divided all the way in half, and I thought, well, all right, so what is the real picture of that? Well, this map is the CIA produced this, and you can see that some an analyst had written down here the Federal Republic of Germany. Now that's what West Germany was called. Okay, was the Federal Republic of Germany. The German Democratic Republic is what East Berlin was, and it surrounded West Berlin. See, it wasn't just like they took the country and divided it in half. West Berlin was half of Berlin City, and you can see the outline. This is the city limits of Berlin here, the outline, and then you had the dividing line, which went through the Brandenburg Gate area, and that contained what is called West Berlin. Now, this is what you did when you wanted to get out of the east and into the west. You jumped over the wall, or made it under the wall, and if you go to the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, they have some fascinating improvised devices made of things like tin cans and umbrellas and pieces of rubber and all kinds of just amazing ingenuity, where the East Germans had made different types of equipment, hidden spaces in cars and so forth, to get into West Germany through one of the checkpoints. Checkpoint Charlie was not the only checkpoint, but it was the main one that grabbed the news attention. And it was located about in this part of Berlin. But West didn't mean the complete western half of Germany. It meant West in the political sense, that this part of Berlin was controlled by the West. Now, East Berlin encompassed all of the area that was controlled by the Soviets, who were given that during the division of Germany after World War II. So to escape into the West, you would have to jump into this ring of this enclave, and you'll notice this is the famous Tempelhof Airport. That's where, when these people were first put into this enclave, they were starving, and it was the Allies that began flying food drops into them, and they went to Tempelhof Airport for the main drops of food deliveries. And I spent about 6 hours in Tempelhof Airport one time waiting for a plane. And I thought, well, surely, I'm going in thinking, well, they're going to have some kind of great display with videos and all this about, the Tempelhof Airport's importance to the survival of West Germany. And guess what? There's nothing, absolutely nothing there. You'll find in Germany that there is a downplay of some of these issues. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But anyway, this was what West Germany was, and that's a real CIA map, and I would love to know what that piece of tape is covering. I would bet that's some kind of a, I hope it's a spy hideout or something. But anyway, let's move on. Okay, so when we get into Berlin, I would say the trademark, the most notable feature of Berlin is the Brandenburg Gate, which to me as an architect, it's a beautiful structure, it's well proportioned, it's well designed. The Brandenburg Gate was an 18th century monument that was commissioned by Frederick William II of Prussia. Now you have to remember that Germany was at one time parts of Germany were called Prussia. And this was after a war that had been going on for a while, and Frederick II erected this as a peace monument. Now, oddly enough, it also became the representation after the Allies finally got to Berlin. They showed lots of film newsreels of the Brandenburg Gate almost in ruins because of the shelling that went on in Berlin. But it was originally intended to be a peace monument, which I find to be very interesting. The Brandenburg Gate was designed by Karl Lagens, who was he was not a notable architect, but he was part of the Prussian government at the time. And one of the things that most Americans can identify with is this particular speech that was made on June 26th of 1963. This is where most Americans became aware of the Cold War and what it meant to the Germans. And if you look carefully, that man right there is President John F. Kennedy delivering his famous Ich bin ein Berliner, I think you would say. And what it means is, I am a Berliner. Now the interesting thing about this photograph is it was taken by one of the Secret Service agents, so it was taken from behind the podium, and it shows the Brandenburg Gate here, and you can see the first version of the wall. The wall was officially started in '61, but it wasn't until years later that the modern version of the wall, which was reinforced concrete, came into being, because it took time to do that. You can't just build a wall in one day. So the first version of it was a masonry structure, and you can see the Berlin Wall with the Brandenburg Gate. And interesting to note is that there are these large red curtains hung inside the Brandenburg Gate openings, which today, if you look at it in all of its glorious beauty, as it was intended to be, are open. And they didn't want the people from the east to be able to see what was going on in the west, and probably vice versa. But nonetheless, the Brandenburg Gate is a landmark that you will probably see first as you enter the city of Berlin. Okay, now I'm going to move just to the left. You see the Brandenburg Gate here, and then this is the Reichstag. Now this building has a lot of significance because it's been the chancellery building for the Third Reich, and it was heavily bombarded because of that. And what has happened since that time, it was laid in ruins for many years. Basically the building was built in 1894. It was the home of the German Diet, which is like their parliamentary body. And the ruined building was partially refurbished at some point along the way, but in 1990, the famous British architect Norman Foster, who is responsible for many of your famous British buildings, came along and did a complete renovation on the Reichstag. Now, one of the things here that you see is this dome. And if you don't go to any other places in Berlin, I would say, go look at Brandenburg Gate, take your picture in front of it, do your selfies, and then go to the Reichstag. Because it is very interesting when you go in, you'll be going up to the top. Now, there is, at the top of the building, this is what it looks like today. You see the dome here. Most of this is the parliamentary portion of it, but I think the dome is the most interesting. And what Norman Foster did with that dome was he created not only a source of light for the parliamentary space, which is below it, but he also created something I'll show you in just a second. This is what it looked like right after World War II, which you can tell there was some heavy damage. I think more than heavy damage. This building was almost completely destroyed by the Allies bombing Berlin. But if we look at this dome, you'll notice that it has not only a series of mirrors in this central cone, which are designed to produce light into the space below through this glass ceiling, but it has this ramp that goes up, and you can walk all the way up to the top. Now, if you need pictures of Berlin, this is one of the best places to take them. But there's a symbolic significance to this. Now, we know pretty much, being our generation, we know the basic history of what happened in the 1930s when Adolf Hitler was able to take over the government of Germany. And as a result of that, Norman Foster, who, being British, felt the results of it directly, designed this glass ceiling with a rail around it. And the significance of that is that the people who were sitting in the parliament, who were running the government, always had the feeling that people are watching them, okay? That's pretty symbolic. They know that there's people who are their citizenry that they're responsible to standing up there looking down on them. The Reichstag building and the famous renovation by Norman Foster. Okay, so let me show you another interesting monument. Now this doesn't look like much more than a parking lot or a tennis court from above, but this is the Berlin Wall Memorial. And what you see is the actual existing 60-meter portion of the Berlin Wall. This is also located in the area of the Brandenburg Gate. It's just all of these things that I'm showing you right here. You can walk from one to the other very easily. However, there's more than just a little significance to this. For one thing, this is the width that you had to cross if you were trying to escape from the east into the west. Now remember, the west was an enclave, okay? It wasn't just a pure division that if you jumped across it you would be able to keep going. But once you got into the west, they were very helpful in taking former East Germans and getting them out of Germany altogether, or maybe integrating them into the society in West Germany. Now this is what it looks like, and I'll admit it's not stunning like a building, but they have some exhibits here that are very, I guess, they kind of pull at your heartstrings, really. There's a name list of people who died when they tried to escape and things like that. And it shows you how high the wall was up close, so you can imagine yourself trying to run across this field that had landmines, it had machine guns in towers, it had barbed wire, it had lighting at night, and then you got to the concrete wall. So if you made it past all of the other stuff, you still had to scale over the wall. And the Berlin Wall Memorial is the place to see what that was like. Now, here again is another illustration of the wall. So this purple line is the Berlin city limits. And then if you look at the top arrow, this is the beginning of the wall, and in the middle we have the area that I'm talking about now, where the Wall Memorial and the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag were. And then the wall goes down to this point where it ended. So this was Soviet-controlled Berlin, and this was the Allied-controlled Berlin. Now when I say Allies, who would that be? Well, we all know from our World War II history, we have the Soviet bloc over here, which is red. Then we have the American sector, we have the British sector, and we have the French sector. So those three countries controlled West Berlin. So I hope that clarifies for you. When you go to Berlin, you hear two main things. You hear about the Cold War period, and then you hear about the devastation and the bombings and the World War II aspects of it. So this kind of clears up some of the Cold War situation with the East and West. Now, one of the biggest attractions, although very small, it's not much in terms of being a building, is a place called Checkpoint Charlie. And right here is the Checkpoint Charlie that remains from the Cold War period. And this is where you would cross from the east to the west, and you would also be able to enter East Berlin through Checkpoint Charlie if you were in the west. So if you're a fan of the spy novel writers like John le Carré, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, those kinds of books, Ken Follett, and they talk about people entering the East. Well, much of that had to do with passing through this checkpoint. And this is what it looks like now. There's a museum here called the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, and as I was saying before, you see the desperation of the East Germans. I remember one particular device. It was like a line, nothing more than a clothesline, and a man had worked for years to accumulate the materials to build this, so that he could put his baby son, who was a baby when he was, first started the idea, that when he was a toddler, he could put him in this thing and shoot him across over to West Berlin, which, I mean, to do that with a 2 or 3 year old child is pretty crazy now, I mean, we think, but these people were very desperate when it came to getting out of East Berlin because of the oppression that was going on there. Now, if you look at Checkpoint Charlie in 1977, this is what it was. It was just a couple of these pre-manufactured type buildings, not much really to look at. If you go there now, they have these signs erected, and as you're entering the west, they have an American soldier. As you're entering the east, they have a Russian soldier on these signs so that you kind of know which way you're going. But the museum's rather interesting. I recommend it. Now, I don't think it's air conditioned though, so don't wear your sweater. Now, looking at another place that's very interesting, the Jewish Museum. This is one of the most unusual buildings. It was a Jewish museum that was built prior to Adolf Hitler coming to power. And it was to celebrate the Jewish history of Berlin, which there were a lot of Jewish people who lived in Berlin. Now, Daniel Liebenskind, who is a modern architect, one who's with us today, has designed many buildings that are very controversial. And you notice this is not some error in this photograph. Daniel Liebenskind has a style of building that is somewhat bizarre, okay, just to be frank with you. And if you look at the building from the side angle, you'll see, this is an actual photograph of it, this long structure with this Holocaust memorial, and then it has this strange sculpture here. But you see where these cracks, it almost looks like somebody took a hatchet to this building, doesn't it? It's like a nice clean shape, but it has all of these crevices in it. Well, this was his attempt to show what the oppression of the Jews under the Nazi Party was all about. So as you go into it, and this is probably one of the most striking rooms in the whole place, is in the Holocaust memorial portion of it, there's this one room that's enormously tall, and all it has is this one little sliver of light at the top. It's a very strange feeling when you go in there. So that's the Jewish Museum. That's also in the range of walking distance from the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, and it is in the range of walking from the Brandenburg Gate, which I'm sort of using as our center of location here. Now, I'm going to look at something else that's a little odd. Okay, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this before, but this is called the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. A rather ominous name, but that's the official name of it. Now, what you have is a large, it's about, I would say, maybe a 4-acre piece of land, and it has just hundreds and hundreds of these blocks. And in the architectural world, another of the avant-garde architects of today, who I happen to have worked with at one point, not because of my notoriety, but his notoriety. I was a student, and he was invited to come to our university as a lecturer and to work on a project. And his name is Peter Eisenman. Now, with a name like Eisenman, Peter Eisenman was Jewish. So he is Jewish. And the thing that he designed is this large field of these block-like structures, some high, some low, some skewed at an odd angle, and there's some names embedded into them. But the feeling that you get as you walk through this memorial is just almost like being lost in another world, and one that's very bleak and stark. And I know that might not appeal to you if you're in favor of maybe going to ride a carousel, but the point is that these architects were trying to explain to the public the feeling of these things. And when you have the Jewish Museum and then this memorial, you get that. But anyway, this is another one that you may want to go see, and you can just quickly walk through it. So let's talk on the bright side of Berlin. Now, Potsdamer was a town outside of Berlin, and Potsdam, excuse me. Now the Potsdamer Platz, which simply means the Potsdamer space or place, is an area that remained completely destroyed up until, I would say, about the late 80s to mid-90s, when there was an effort put forth by the German government to completely change it into what they saw as the city of the future. And when you go there, it is very impressive. The names that you'll see, this is where all of the big names of German technology are, and some of those would be like Daimler, Daimler was one of the chief corporations that funded the reconstruction of the Potsdamer Platz. But you can drive through this area on a tour and you'll be amazed at all of the unusual structures, high-rise structures that are all fairly new within the last 20 years. Many of them very inventive, and the names on the doors and windows are pretty impressive. And then I want to show you something and tell you a quick little story. The Olympic Stadium, which is the 1936 Olympic Stadium, is still there, and this is what it looked like in 1936. Okay, so 1936 was a good year for good old Adolf Hitler. I shouldn't say good old, I'm sorry. For Adolf Hitler. It was where he was rising to power. It was before he had actually gone to war in Poland, so he was riding high on his expectations for this new Germany philosophy that he had. And as a result of that, he decided to host, he put in his bid and ended up hosting the 1936 Olympic Games. Okay, that was important to Germany and important to Hitler. Now, for the attendees, let's say you were from another country and it wasn't wartime yet, so you wouldn't be disallowed to go in there, but when you attended the Olympic Games in 1936, this was what you were greeted with. Thousands and thousands of Germans doing the Heil Hitler during the opening ceremony, and you could see up there the Nazi flag flying right along beside the British flag, the American flag, the French flag. They had the swastika. One thing I'd like to point out is that if you're in a biker gang, I don't know how many of you people would be, but let's just say that you have a swastika leather jacket with you or a swastika t-shirt. I would advise you not to wear it inside the country of Germany. Why? Because it's illegal. You cannot have the swastika shown anywhere inside the country of Germany, and the police will get you for that. So keep those items in your stateroom. All right, so this is what they were greeted with. Now, at the time, during the opening ceremony, all of these blonde-haired Germans come out marching and walking, and they're having all of the audience with the Sieg Heil, and they thought that they were going to be victorious because they were psychologically brainwashed into thinking that they were the master race. This was due to the efforts of people like Joseph Goebbels at the time. However, what they didn't expect, let's just make sure I don't skip a slide. Was this man. This man, yes. He was an American. He was an American track star, and his name was, of course, none other than Jesse Owens, born in 1913 in Oakville, Alabama, an African-American track star who showed up at the 1936 German Olympics in Berlin. Unfortunately for Hitler's dream, Jesse Owens went on to win quite a few of the medals in the game. He won the gold medal in the 100-meter long jump, the 200-meter long jump, and the 400-meter relay he also won. So, I'm sorry, Adolf, but our guy from Alabama beat you. Yeah, that was too bad for him. But anyway, this was a big upset and infuriated Hitler. Now, as you go around the area of the Brandenburg Gate and walk up the Bunderstrasse, which is what the main city street is here, you'll come to the Berlin Cathedral, also called the Berliner Dom, D-O-M. That's what the Germans call it. This is a Protestant cathedral, not Catholic. The Germans were heavily into the Reformation, and so this is, you'll find Lutheran churches in particular in most parts of Germany. And this was sort of a multi-denominational Protestant church. So when you go in there, rather than seeing the Catholic icons and statuary, you'll see the Reformation Martin Luther statues or depictions of Martin Luther and others who were part of the Protestant movement. And it's a beautiful cathedral. It's in great shape, somehow survived the bombing of Berlin. And it is quite nice to go there. And over on this side of the river, there is a nice bank of cafes, and if you want to have an enjoyable afternoon, a rest stop in Berlin, you can sit at this area where the cafes are. And there may be a few along here, but this park is where a lot of Berliners come to lay out and get sun. And you have to realize that sun is very important when you live in this part of the world. German women, just like the Swedish women, take advantage of that by going topless, so don't be offended if you see some German women in this park like that. Might be a good reason to go there, guys, I don't know, but anyway. This is a big park, and this is Humboldt University over here. That's an extraordinary looking building. I've never quite figured out what it is, but it was started by the Humboldt University, and it is really bizarre. It's almost like the Jewish museum that I showed you. Now this is one of my favorite buildings in Berlin. It's the Alts Museum. This is what the Berliner Dom looks like now, restored. Now the Alts Museum was designed by a famous neoclassical architect who I happen to have a lot of reverence for, named Friedrich Schinkel. He was before the time of Hitler, before the Third Reich, designing buildings around Berlin, and he was an expert of the neoclassical style of architecture. And so, as you can see, we have, after the Allies entered Berlin, the statuary, the building was bombed out, much like the Reichstag was. However, the main parts of it were able to be saved, and today you have the beautiful restored version of the Alts Museum. And this is part of Museum Island, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. But the museums in Berlin are very famous, and they are world-class, and they do have many periods of art. Not like, well, I wouldn't say that you didn't see all the periods of art when you went to St. Petersburg, but it's sort of focused more on that early, the church icon type art. But when you're in Berlin, you have to remember that this was probably the most forward-thinking city of its time, okay? And so if you like the avant-garde, if you like the bizarre, if you like art that is meant to shock, then you can go to Museum Island, and there are 11 museums on Museum Island. So it's right, I positioned this view so that you could see kind of where we are, the Tiergarten being the main the main park, and then you come up the Bundesstrasse, there's the Berliner Dom, the Alts Museum, and then here are all of the other museums on Museum Island. So you could spend a month, more, a year going through all of these museums. But there's good tours available. Again, check your short excursion outline and see if there's some for this. But Museum Island is a very beautiful place. This museum in particular is called the Bode Museum, and it's at the northern end of that. So now that I've talked a little bit, it's got a few minutes here. I always tell my friends, and I notice my friends from Quebec, I always have what I call the bedtime story, so that you will have a nice, restful, comfortable sleep tonight. I'll tell you the bedtime story. I want to talk about something that is something that you live with every day. You live with, and you have lived with every day of your life, but you probably didn't know it, okay? Now what I'm talking about is an art movement that started in Berlin in the 1920s called German Expressionism. Now, for the most part, German Expressionism was in movie making and architecture. As far as German Expressionism in art, there was some, but it wasn't one of these explosive type art movements like we had in France with the, let's say for instance, you had the modernist movement where you had the Picassos and the Cubism and that kind of thing. German Expressionism was more geared towards psychology, because at the time you had quite a bit of that going on in Berlin. This is back during the 1920s. So you had a lot of groundbreaking work into things like psychology and controversial subjects like sexuality. You had also things to come along later that had to do with mass psychology. But I'm going to start with the film industry because this is big. This is where I'm going. All right, you had Babelsberg Studios. All right, now this was prior to Hollywood ever being conceived. In Germany, in Berlin, right outside of the city, you had Babelsberg Studios. Now, they produced a series of films, and I'm just going to quickly go through them. One of them, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, was an expressionist film, and it was said that when this character, who played this character in the film poster, first appeared on the screen, that women fainted in the theater because they had been promoting the movie as a horror film, and when they saw that face, which to me doesn't look that scary by today's standards, but you have to understand most of the films in the 1920s were silent films, and you didn't have a lot of horror films at the time. But the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was a German expressionist film that was considered to be the quintessential work of expressionism about an insane hypnotist, okay? That's a weird subject, but hypnotism and the psychological things that were going on at the time were a big part of the Berlin intellectual thought. And so he used this character here as one of his hypnotized people in the film. Now, another notable film is Metropolis. And if you're a film buff or you've ever taken a film appreciation class in college, most professors will point out that Metropolis was a groundbreaking film. Now, the thing about Metropolis was that it kind of went over into some of the communist thought that was going on at the time, because you had a race of people where the majority were workers, and almost like mindless workers. And when you watch this film, which was produced by Fritz Lang, or Long, it was strange because you had the planners, and this is a depiction of Marie, a robot who was one of the planners and one of the main characters in the movie Metropolis, and they were always talking about what is good for the workers. Well, the workers weren't doing so well. They were walking in this sort of marching step all throughout the movie to work, and they didn't have much of a life. However, the planners lived in sort of a utopia. So that was the theme of Metropolis, and you see the artwork here. This is German Expressionism artwork. And then you had another significant movie, Nosferatu. This was sort of a German vampire movie, but this one really scared the heck out of the Germans because they had the hype and the, you know, kind of the advertising behind this movie, just like a lot of our modern day movies. And it had these strange scenes in it. The character Nosferatu was very frightening to look at, and you had these scenes where it was shot all in shadow light with no person actually in it, but you see the you know, the horror element in it as Nosferatu was going up to probably do some evil deed. Now, I want to show you why I think this was so important. Look at this picture and tell me, let's just raise your hand if you happen to recognize this man right here. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfie Hitchcock, one of the greatest filmmakers of our time, one of the greatest filmmakers ever. When he was a young man, this is in 1927, and you can tell he's very young here, he went to Babelsberg studio and he was learning filmmaking. This is where he learned how to do what he did. And so I'm trying to find her name just for a second. Yes, he said, okay, first of all, his statement was, everything I had to know about filmmaking, I learned in Babelsberg. That was Hitch who said that. Now he was filming a film called Mountain Eagle, which very well could have been either like a typical German film, or it could have been one of these expressionist films, but most likely it was an expressionist film. And you notice this lady in the background, well, that was Alma Reville, who later became the wife of Alfred Hitchcock. Okay, and she kept him straight because later in life Alfred developed sort of a passion for good-looking blondes that he starred in all of his movies, and he had this loyal wife who seemed to know that he was fascinated by the beauty of these women. Although Hitchcock was not necessarily involved with them as we would think, he did have a fascination with them. And one of those women was the beautiful Janet Leigh, who was this lady who starred in Psycho. And if you remember back in 1960, when this movie came out, people of, I guess maybe like my generation or my mother's generation, of course I'm a little too young for that, but they discussed whether they were going to see Psycho. It was, are you going to go see Psycho? Like it was a decision you had to make because you didn't want it to, you know, create some sort of terrible thing in your mind for the rest of your life. And the same with the Birds. I can remember when the Birds came out, the question was, are you brave enough to go see the Birds? It's so scary. Well, in Psycho, it just so happens that Hitchcock, who had learned all of his techniques at the Babelsberg studio in Berlin during the time of the German Expressionists, never showed in the movie Psycho actual violence, in the sense that, as compared to a modern day movie where you see guns blasting and people exploding and that kind of thing, in Psycho, it's all in your mind, because there never was a scene where the knife that Norman Bates used actually was shown touching Janet Leigh, who was the victim. So how did you get so scared? It's because of the techniques of expressionism. And one of the things that expressionism was good at was shocking people. So you had scenes like this. How many of you remember that? Was that not a moment in your life if you saw Psycho in 1960? The shower scene of Psycho is still today considered one of the masterpieces of not only filmmaking, but of the horror movie genre, not only that genre, but of filmmaking in general. And Janet Leigh, who was, of course, unfortunately, the victim during the movie, became famous and was nominated and won the Best Supporting Actress Academy Award in 1960 for this movie. But it really put Hitchcock on the map. And the reason that I say that German Expressionism affects all of you is because the same directors that were running Babelsberg Studio, and many of them were Jewish, by the way, when Adolf Hitler came to power, they moved to a place that was hardly known outside of the city of Los Angeles, and they named it Hollywood. Okay? These same directors started Hollywood from Babelsberg in Berlin, and when you see movies like The Matrix, which you'll have to say is pretty odd, 2001 Space Odyssey, the whole Stanley Kubrick genre type of movie, it all came from Expressionism. So, with that said, I'd like to close my lecture now. And if you'd like to catch me afterwards, it's time for me to get off the stage. I'd like to thank you for coming. And we have another lecture on the 19th, which will be about Estonia and Russia. And I promise you, I'm going to give you the part that they didn't tell you while you were there, okay? Just to give you a little teaser. And then on the 20th, I have a lecture in the same place at 10:30 instead of 10 on cryptocurrencies. And I know quite a bit about cryptocurrencies and have been involved with them for a while. So if you've ever heard about Bitcoin and wondered what it was and whether you should have some and how it works, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know if you don't know anything at all about Bitcoin and all of the other cryptocurrencies. So I hope you'll join me for that, and I want to thank all of you for coming today.